All right, we're going to let everybody mosey in to the virtual room, and we'll get started here in just a minute. All right, Chris, what do you say? Let's do it.
Shall we get going?
Let's get going. Okay, well, hello, everybody. It's great to be with you, and it's really great to be with my friend, Chris Collin from General Mills. I'm Carrie Penman, the Chief Risk and Compliance Officer from NAVEX, and we'll do our introductions in just a few minutes, but welcome to our session on ensuring effective speak up amid changing reporting trends. And we actually are really looking forward to sharing with you some trends, some of the data that you may already be aware of that we've reported on from NAVEX, looking back at 2021, but then taking that information and kind of reflecting on what does this mean? And not everybody, as you'll hear from Chris, had the same trends that we saw in the NAVEX data. So, you know, what are some things that that General Mills is doing that, you know, maybe, you know, doing just a phenomenal job in encouraging speak up in your organization. I know, right? Here we go. So with that, I'm hoping that this actually will move to the next slide. There we go. So I'm Carrie Penman, Chief Risk and Compliance Officer for NAVEX. And I've been with NAVEX going on 19 years this year, which is really hard to believe. Started in ethics and compliance in 1994 at Westinghouse as the first ethics officer there. And then I had the wonderful opportunity to serve ECI as its deputy director of that time, the Ethics Officer Association, for almost 4 years there. So really delighted to be joined by Chris. So Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Carrie. Chris Collin, I manage the Ethics and Compliance program here at General Mills, and I was hired in 2006 to do just that. I was hired to come in and help create our Ethics and Compliance program. It's something I'm very proud of, and so I'm also really happy to be here and working with Carrie, who I admire greatly. So it's fun to be able to work together on this webinar today. So welcome, and I have also served on the board for ECI. I was chair of the membership committee at one point, vice chair, and so I have a heart for this association as well. So I'm really glad you're all here.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, I had served on the board in the 90s, so it's a wonderful, wonderful organization. Absolutely. Okay, so a little bit about General Mills and your program there.
Yeah, absolutely. So we'll just start here, and Carrie, I'll just sort of prompt you as we go along here because I know you're driving. So our purpose at General Mills is serving the world by making food the world loves. And over the course of this pandemic, we also quickly realized as food was not on shelves and there just was a lot of uncertainty, our purpose was to not only make food the world loves, but also food the world needs. And so we're going to move on to the next slide so you can see a little bit about, well, what is that food I'm talking about? So these are our brands. It's just a handful of our portfolio. I imagine you can recognize some of them in there. I know in the US, we're mostly known for Cheerios, but there's some global brands you'll see there that are very important in China, in Brazil. Old El Paso is big in Europe, and so as is Nature Valley. So there's some brands that are large and wonderful and beloved. We've been making food for people in over 150 years, or 155 years. So a long-standing company. It started with milling gold medal flour on the banks of the Mississippi River, and Pillsbury grew up milling flour on the opposite side of the river. And we acquired them back in the 2000s. And you can go ahead and move on. You can get a sense of, here's our brands, and then here's our scale. So I mentioned, you know, during the pandemic, we actually grew. I mean, we were making food. We had to make some choices. You know, maybe we didn't have as many varieties of Progresso soup on the shelf, but we were making sure we could make enough to get that food on the shelf. And so we had some growth years over the last few years. We have employees worldwide. And so those employees sit in roles that are like manufacturing. You know, we have people on the plant floor. We have people that are in remote sales. And outside the US, we have Haagen-Dazs shops. So we have people who are scooping ice cream and in kiosks or in sort of luxury shops in China. If you get to the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit more. I know, right? I hope you had breakfast, and I hope it was cereal. And so, and so here I want to land here for just a little bit, because I think this is really the slide that tells our story more greatly. And I'm actually going to cheat a little bit. I've got a couple notes to make sure I get this right, because it's something that I find really important to me. It's something I'm really proud of as an employee of General Mills, because while we serve the world by making food people love, pets love, right? We acquired Blue Buffalo a couple of years ago. We know that that is absolutely entwined with being a force for good. Like our whole presence relies on the environment. And we need to do the things we need to do to take care of that, or else we're not going to be able to feed people. So just today we launched our, I think it's our 52nd Global Responsibility Report. So we have been publishing global responsibility reports for 52 years. And we focus on these 4 pillars. These are our strategic pillars. Regenerating our planet. So that includes things like reducing greenhouse gas emissions, protecting watersheds, regenerative agriculture, which is more than just good soil health. It's actually carbon capture and things to renew the soil. And we work with farmers and crops to make sure that we're teaching farmers these practices. And then we also have, and then of course, recyclable packaging or reusable packaging. Food security. So, we're a food company. We focus on making sure that we're alleviating hunger and improving food security around the world. So we partner with organizations like Feeding America, the Global Food Bank, No Kid Hungry, to make sure that there is nutritious food available for people worldwide. One of my favorite things that we invest in is a group called Partners in Food Solutions. And that is engineers and scientists from our company partner with small manufacturers of food in countries in Africa and helping them build their scale and their capabilities and their food safety practices so they can manufacture food that their neighbors and friends love within their country. Next thing is protecting our people. And so in that, I would focus on racial equity commitments that we have made. We've made them in 3 places. So food security, focusing on food security in areas that are disproportionately impacted communities of color. Our education program, so Box Tops, which is a long-standing program, has a legacy of giving over $1 billion to schools, is now focusing on creating greater equity in education for children of color so they can reach their full potential. And then within our own workforce, representation in our workforce. So we're doubling the representation of our Black managers, increasing our overall representation of minorities to 25%, and doubling our spend with minority-owned suppliers. So that's how we're living out those values. And then strengthening our communities. We have a very high rate, about 80% of our employees volunteer worldwide. Charitable giving, volunteerism, how we stand up and show up in our communities. And I mention all this, I know ESG is a topic that's on our minds. I mention this because I think, even though I'm not an expert on these things, that's why I need my notes, but they are things that are so dear and so ingrained in who we are that they absolutely speak to culture. So, I have topics I focus on in our ethics and compliance program. I don't necessarily focus on these, but our employees experience that culture holistically. And there's a great pride in being a company that really takes care for our planet, our people, and I think that shows up in how we show up every day.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And I think it's phenomenal that, we're starting a discussion about our ethics and compliance program and relating it to environment, social, and governance, because it is so important to our employees, and it's impacting, how they're thinking about our organizations, how they want to work at our organizations, and the types of things that they may choose to report to us that they see as not acceptable or not fitting within the culture.
That's correct.
Spouse. So really, really enjoyed hearing that about General Mills. So we're just going to move on to kind of talk about some of the data, how employees are reporting, some of the changes and some of the trends that we saw in last year's data. But just very quickly, and I won't go into a lot of detail because I'm guessing that a number of you may have already seen the webinar that we did earlier this year. So I really want to just take some of the key trends and kind of bounce those back and forth with Chris. But just very quickly, just to level set, we benchmark an anonymized data set from all of the reports that NAVEX receives or has within the databases from our customers' hotlines and web reporting and cases that they would have entered directly into the system. So for accuracy, we only include organizations that receive 10 or more reports because we want to be sure that we're actually benchmarking organizations that have active programs. It's frankly disappointing the number of companies that don't have even 10 reports in a year. And that's certainly a culture indicator right off the bat. And, it's a trend that maybe we don't talk about in our big webinars, but I think it's something that I think it is important to comment on the fact that organizations that don't receive any reports, as we all know, this is not good news. So the resulting database was close to 3,500 companies who did receive at least 10 reports. And those organizations had 1.375 million reports that we were able to analyze. For the most part, we use medians or midpoints, meaning that half the organizations would be higher and half would be lower. And again, to try to be as statistically relevant as we can, we don't want one organization to throw off an entire benchmark. And I think the most important thing to remember as we're talking about this is there are no right outcomes. Organizations have different levels of reporting or different metrics for a whole host of reasons. And, Chris is going to share a couple, right? We all have maybe different ways that we ask employees to report. For example, Chris is going to talk about the fact that they have a food safety line. So we're not going to see those reports in her web reporting or hotline reporting. So those are the kinds of things. That's why the ranges are really important and to not really get hung up on a one number in particular. So what were some of the key themes that we found in the 2021 data? So this is our 2022 report looking back at 2021. We do still have some COVID trends that remain. We are finding that whistleblowers are more emboldened than ever. And we saw a very interesting spike in reports about retaliation, discrimination, and harassment. So we'll try to walk through each of these trends, and also, please feel free to ask questions. I know those questions will get pasted over to us, so we'll keep an eye on this. And I see there's already one for Chris. So do you want to take a second and address that one?
Absolutely. So let me get it back up here. I just popped on. Okay. So purpose. Yeah, we have a purpose. And underneath that, we have a strategy. Right now, our strategy we talk about is accelerating. And there's some pieces behind that. Part of that acceleration is what I just shared with you, that being a force for good. And then we do have values. And actually, we're in the process of reimagining our values and seeing how those really fit. The one that isn't going to change is do the right thing. So as we've done with our corporate communications and our HR and other functions have done this assessment of what sticks, do the right thing all the time. People know it. And it's sort of a shorthand for our code in many ways. And I actually have opportunities to listen into leader interviews with our global internal audit group. I can talk about that later. And I ask about how they bring that to life for their employees, and they can very quickly talk about what that looks like. So that is definitely ones that we have. We have our code of conduct. It's principles based. I call it the field guide to policies. It's really, it's more, here's the stuff we expect. This is how to be General Mills. And underneath that, we're going to tell you more about our more detailed expectations. So I hope that answers your question. And if not, just go ahead and ask it again in a different way.
It's interesting because doing the right things right. And we just went through a values review as well at NAVEX, and doing the right things right is one that stayed. Yeah. So that's pretty important.
It's inspiring, right?
So it is inspiring.
Yeah.
So, in terms of what all of us or many of us saw is that overall, the first year of COVID, we saw that report volumes dropped pretty significantly. And in particular, obviously it dropped when a lot of organizations closed down and moved home. In the spring of 2020. We actually saw a very similar dip in the spring of 2021, but we did see that report volumes remain down. We are still seeing that reporting levels go up and down with COVID cases, so it'll be interesting to see what's happening now. As you may recall, we had a very high level of cases related to safety in the prior year. Those have come down a little bit, but they're still elevated from our typical levels. All of us compliance officers did a pretty good job of keeping steady on case closure times and substantiation rates. And what's most fascinating is all the time we're all spending on computers, phone reporting remains very important. Mm-hmm. So just quickly here, I'll just go through a couple of these data points because we actually want to get more into detail on the second and third trend, but just to make sure that you all kind of have the level set on this. As you can see, we dropped down in 2020 for reports per 100 employees. We were dropped from 1.4 to 1.3. Doesn't sound like much, but it's actually the volume of reports we take. That's a pretty significant jump or drop. We did actually receive more reports in 2021, but it didn't yet move us back to 1.4 reports per 100 employees. So we may see that coming back next year. Perhaps some of the more interesting points I'll note here. First is that, as you can see, the EH&S or environment, health, and safety cases do remain elevated. So as I mentioned, we were at the highest level in 2020, and that was 11% of all the reports. Again, not surprising. We had so many reports about COVID and workplace safety and masking and all of the rest. So we did see it recede a little bit down to 9%. But as you can see, prior years, it was more like 6 or 7. Perhaps one of the more notable observations, and we'll touch on this when we get into the trend on whistleblowers being more emboldened, is that we did see for the first time a pretty significant jump in allegations of accounting, auditing, and financial reporting cases around that. So more on that in a moment, but I also wanted to share with you that for the first time this year, we've broken other out of HR. And so the true number of HR related cases is actually 50%. With other included, it was 63. We just wanted to make sure everybody had the baseline to compare, but we have pulled other out. That's a category I kind of call, I don't know, feral cats and donuts. So those are the kinds of reports that really, truly don't belong anywhere else. And that the HR cases are truly, employee relations, things like harassment, discrimination, retaliation, comp and benefits, so on and so forth. So, I think, Chris, I think it's interesting because highlighting this HR is that, you and I were talking about kind of how you all handle HR reports and recognizing that the HR reports are telling us a lot in terms of culture, right? Back to the conversation about culture. But, organizations manage these in different ways. And if you maybe just spend a minute or so talking about how you manage them at General Mills.
Yeah, absolutely. We all definitely manage these cases in different ways. So in our group for ethics and compliance, we focus on issues like conflicts of interest, business conduct issues, conflicts, fraud, anti-corruption, anti-competition, confidential information. We handle any kind of HR related case like a discrimination or an HR concern. We pass that over to HR. But what's unique here is we're not passing it necessarily back to the group that may have already managed that situation. We have an employee relations team that sits within our law department. They're HR function, but they report in through our employment lawyer in our law department. And that team handles sort of what we call the more gnarly issues. I mean, the things that take a lot of technical expertise to handle. So they handle accommodation requests. They handle cases related to workplace harassment or discrimination. They handle leaves of absence and performance management. And so I work very closely with this team because even if I get an HR related case, I'm going to hand it over to them, but we will partner throughout to see if there's any touch point back to me or not, so we're definitely very connected that way. But I don't really follow up on the outcome. We let the reporter know, I gave your report to this individual, here's their contact information. They can communicate back and forth with the the reporter through the system. And then I'll manage all the cases that come in that are related to business conduct. Usually I'm using global security to help, but we're still partnering with HR because they're still involved in that performance and that disciplinary action. So it's a little bit different, and they are working on expanding. Right now it's a US based group and then Canada they've added on. We're looking to expand into Brazil, China, India, places where we have larger employee groups, but also making sure we're having the expertise of employment law within those countries to inform how we handle all of these issues for our employees.
One thing we know for sure, that if some of these types of investigations are botched, as they say,
Right.
we could have, much bigger problems, and things that start out as small things end up becoming much bigger things.
Right.
And I know some people have heard me say, but we actually found at Westinghouse that when we started to spike the HR related cases out of location, that we had other more serious issues, and that was often the canary in the coal mine. So I think it's really important to keep tabs on this. And as you said, to partner with the HR team to ensure that, we're looking at data in a whole.
Absolutely. And I have a database now that I can use to look at my reports. And I shared that I had a global internal audit analyst create it for me. And we shared that with the head of the ER team, so they could use that as their last for building theirs, because they were working on building a similar thing, so that in the end, we could sort of compare apples to apples and get some more insights as they're looking at trends for turnover rates and issues in reporting. And so we can kind of start seeing the universe of information.
Right. So we'll talk in a little bit about, the importance of tracking reports from all sources and what it might be telling us. So some additional data points, and this is actually the first year that we have looked at the data from the perspective of subcategories. Mm-hmm. So, as you know, so the left-hand column is the major issue categories, right? HR, diversity and workplace respect, business integrity, environment, health and safety, accounting, auditing, and finance, et cetera. But then we also have gone into sub-issues that will also now map up to the bigger issues, but to give us more insight, if you will, into what we're seeing on a sub-issue or subcategory type. And no surprise that other human resources is at the top. But again, that is the pure HR. It's not the feral cats and not enough donuts on donut day. It is truly, HR related issues. And so we are still dealing with many of those. Two that I will point out, and then Chris, I know you wanted to point out one related to conflict of interest, but the fact that health and safety was 11% of all of the reports received indicates that we still were feeling a lot of impact of COVID, even in 2021. And then to hold the thought on the other two items I put in blue, which is discrimination at almost 4%, and harassment at almost 3%, a little over 3%. Those numbers are actually higher, as we noted in the trends, and we'll spend more time on that later. There's one other point I want to make is on the right side, which is all of the issues that were less than 1% of the 1.375 million reports that we analyzed. And many of these are specific to ESG types of issues, bribery and corruption, product quality and safety, global trade. Now, I expect that with the sanctions issues and all the conversations we're having about that, even at this event, that may pop up next year as a higher level reporting issue. Environmental, human rights, free and fair competition, all of those were less than 1% of all of the reports that we received. So, a question for all of us to think about is this something that we would expect to see more of going forward as organizations are focusing on ESG reporting? issues of potential greenwashing. Will we see changes in ESG type reporting? But Chris, I know you also had another, and somebody said, which category is time reporting and mischarging? That is in other business integrity. So, so you had a comment on the conflict of interest, right, Chris?
Yeah, I do. And I see a couple other questions, and we'll get to, I definitely think we'll have a link to the hotline benchmarking report.
We will. The full report hasn't been published, but there is a more fulsome slide deck that we can also make available to you.
Absolutely. And then we'll get to the question about COVID, working from home, phone reporting. So I caught that. We'll get to that one too. What I was going to talk about was conflicts of interest, and I'm not sure if others on the call have noticed this as well, but that I looked at that and said that seems spot on. I mean, at least for our experience, I feel like everybody's got a side gig, and there's tons of questions that come into us about, can I be a consultant? Can I be an advisor? Can I invest in this startup? Can I create my own startup? And so as I look at that, it resonated with me because we're tracking that. And in fact, because of the degree of questions we're getting and the information we're getting from those, I created a deck that our attorneys who sit on the leadership teams for all of the different businesses are going to be leading their LTs through. And it's, really being cognizant of the fact that, a lot of employees, this isn't the only thing they're working on. And when they hear about it, they need to get that over to ethics and compliance. They need to, if they get it to HR, fine, they'll get it to us, but they need to not manage it on their own because they're complicated. And we want to make sure that we're helping people navigate that appropriately.
So Chris, I think you just got a question, which is, do you have a standard process for evaluating conflicts of interest? Do you limit your scope to just employees?
Yeah, we do primarily limit it to employees. I think we wouldn't really be able to manage conflicts of interest for our thousands of suppliers. What we do manage is a relationship between our employee and that supplier. So we have a process that we run every June called our business conduct certification. It's an attestation. Many of you would have it as your code of conduct training or attestation. It has the code, but it has our 9 business conduct policies that everybody has to attest to, or at least I should say employees in a certain manager level and above, or professional level and above. And that includes our conflict of interest disclosure, where we handle that. One of the things I've developed in order to handle the numerous questions I get is I created a cheat sheet. So just in case I'm gone, somebody else can answer it. And it kind of talks about each question, and it has a series of questions to ask in that situation. So we can sort of help. We don't have to remember all the questions we want to ask. We can kind of click through the guide and make sure we're thinking through all the different angles.
So I think, go ahead.
Let's see, I was just going to see if there's another one too.
Before you move on from conflict though, let me just add one other point, because I think I've spoken with more than one compliance officer who has dealt with a situation, and we read about it in the Wall Street Journal, where people literally have 2 full-time jobs.
Right.
And much of that actually happened during the pandemic while people were working from home. They got their computer over here and they got their computer over here and meetings over there. So yeah, so I think conflict of interest became a bigger issue. So let me just grab a couple of these quick ones. So what is in other human resources? It is pretty much everything but discrimination, harassment, comp and benefits, retaliation, and substance abuse. So it would be the regular employee relations issues. Bullying and intimidation would fall into other human resources if it hasn't risen to the level of harassment or discrimination. So true employee relations issues as opposed to the other category. And
I can share my cheat sheet. I can share some of the training we do on conflicts of interest. Absolutely. So I'll work with ECI on what the best way to get those resources out. And then as far as the conflict of interest, the BCC, It goes to, we have job bands. So they're bands that people have, like it determines kind of what kind of accountability you have in your role, what kind of autonomy. So it's a little bit of kind of defining, director, manager, senior professional, support, kind of think of those ranges. We go to what we call experienced professional and above. So those employees may be hourly or they may be salaried. It's not reaching our operators at our plants or our scoopers in our shops. It is reaching people who would reasonably need to be aware of conflicts of interest, fraud, anti-corruption, anti-competitive, insider trading, accounting, and financial controls. So, I mean, you're testing me, so I should know these by heart. Every time I leave one out.
You can use this list, right?
I know, I'm like, and so, but anyway, it's, so it's those big topics. And so we want to make sure that those employees are fully aware of these expectations. We go deeper in our training. So, but just as far as the attestation, because it's a SOX control, we need 100% completion. It goes to about 10,500 people that we're chasing to complete. And that seems like enough for right now.
So I'll just grab this quick question and then we'll move on. But the question is, are you seeing any changes in terms of increase or decrease in workplace bullying harassment? Oh yeah, and more to come on that. And it's definitely in the area of an increase. Probably no surprise, but this is actually, it was a perfect segue. So whoever asked that question, thank you. To the industries in particular that had the highest levels of reporting within each of the categories. And so, noting that, the topic of this session is ensuring effective speak up in this changing reporting environment. It's important to recognize that every company, every industry is going to see some variation. I think two notable points that I would make here, that the industry that received the most reports related to HR diversity and workplace respect was food services and drinking places, and probably retail, as well, because those are the organizations that were dealing with the public, and in food services in particular, checking vaccine cards and dealing with masks and all of that. And we know the amount of incivility that occurred to employees of these organizations. I think our hearts go out to those people who really had a no-win situation. And the other thing I would point out is that accounting, auditing, and financial reporting, as well as misuse, misappropriation of assets, had the highest number of reports in public administration, which, sort of government. So thinking about all of the amount of money that flowed from COVID relief, and potential misuse of that money, I think that's what we're seeing here. So Chris, I know you had some thoughts on this slide as well.
Yeah, I think this is one where I value that this is in your report, even if I don't necessarily see myself here, at General Mills. I think, like you pointed out with food services, I think this is a great way to think about, what does your graph look like when you map up against this report? And does it make sense to you? And I think HR concerns are generally, I think any company, probably that's the biggest. My guess is going to be that's true, just because we're people and people are messy. But just kind of looking at the nature of the business and thinking about the nature of your business, and are the reports you are receiving and where you have your higher marks, do you have an explanation for that? Are you able to kind of dig into that? And does it feel about right for where you map up against this? So it's useful to see.
Okay, so just a couple of quick wrap-ups in the first trend with related to the remnants of COVID. We had a few more reports last year, and it's taken us a little bit longer to close cases. So ticked up from 39 to 42 days. So we bumped over that sort of magic 30, 40 days of being a good place in terms of closing reports. We're still not back to 2019 levels, but I think, again, something to keep an eye on. But overall, I think with learning how to do remote investigations, organizations really did a phenomenal job.
Yeah.
same with the substantiation rate, that organizations continued even with remote investigations. And, I wonder, and, maybe we can't see the attendee chat, but wondering how all of you are thinking about, how many investigations are going to remain remote, or are you going to go back to doing more in-person investigations? So just something to think about there. And then the final point is with regard to the phone. And I think in some of these trying times, people really want somebody to talk to. As much as we also have been experiencing the keyboard warriors who are just like typing stuff, and they're angry and they're on their last nerve. We had 30% of our customers last year receive the majority of their reports via phone. And so that is pretty interesting to me. And maybe Chris, quick comment from you on this.
Yeah, when we look at our data, the phone is a really important tool, especially for employees in our manufacturing facilities or plants. They're not on a computer. Phones aren't necessarily allowed on the plant floor. And so the ability to get to a website through your mobile, or have access to a website is just not, that's just not their interaction all day long. So having a poster with a phone number, and I heard a great idea the other day about putting a QR code that can bring you up to a website or a phone number, that you can get to. That's really critical for our shops, for our employees who are on the road a lot in sales. Having that phone option is really critical.
Okay, so let's move on to emerging trend 2. And this one really we thought was fascinating. And that is, I think we have a much more emboldened population. We have a much more emboldened workforce. There are a lot of issues that people are feeling comfortable speaking up about. And this is what we saw. So first, I'll reference the SEC report. The external reporting is through the roof. Fraud reporting internally is up. We have more named reporters. We have some bad news in few inquiries. People are just throwing it out there. They're just coming at us with allegations. And then also what we've been seeing in terms of the Great Resignation. So I'm sure many of you have seen this, and I'm looking forward to hearing from the speaker from the SEC later this week. But, look at this jump from 2020 to 2021 in the amount of tips that the SEC received on the program. Granted that this is a bounty program, potentially there's some issues related to the fact that, organizations and that digital realty case where, individuals were not protected unless they reported to the agency. Is that why we're seeing an increase to the agency? But regardless, people are taking their issues outside organizations. And I think for a lot of organizations that monitor Glassdoor, we're seeing a lot of issues there on social media in general. So I think it really changes the way we all think about how we communicate with our employees and how we build that trust for them to come internally. And then just another note on fraud. We did a keyword search, and here is the chart that is just incredible. These are the number of reports that actually contain the word fraud or bribery, and it is peaking and still on its way up in early 2022. So we're getting, and again, not surprising, given the amount of money that was flowing through COVID relief, that this is starting to happen, but it might be something depending on each organization, each industry, what that might mean for your organization. And then this one, just quickly on that, is the fact that anonymous reporting has dropped, and it dropped like a rock between 2019 and 2021. We've been on a slow, steady decline, but down to 50%, where half the reporters are providing their name. That is actually quite phenomenal to me. And Chris, I know you had some data you wanted to share from General Mills on this.
Yeah, I mean, this is a trend that we are we don't necessarily match up to. So we average anonymous reports at about 28% over the last 4 years. I just looked at that stat. So most of our reports are known. And so it's one we feel pretty good about. I think part of that is because we capture a lot of the questions and the issues come directly to ethics and compliance or HR or global security. You know, we kind of field all of that and make sure we're putting it in the system. But I think we tend to have employees or individuals who are more comfortable providing their name.
And I think that leads into
Yeah.
comments you wanted to make here as well. But this to me is quite unfortunate because, you know, either we're not tracking inquiries as much as we have in the past, or we're just not getting them. But, you know, certainly my experience was that often the inquiry was the precursor to the actual allegation, right? Is it a problem if, and so often that, again, that's the precursor, but it may also mean that, you know, maybe we're not tracking as many of those. So Chris, I know you had some comments on this, and then the next slide that we have coming up about organizations that track reports from all sources.
Yeah, and I think this is a good spot. I was going to talk a little bit about kind of the genesis of our ethics and compliance program and some of the work we did in early on. So when I started here, one of the first things we did, because we knew we had to sort of establish our function, you know, and I've mentioned we're a manufacturing company, but we're also really much a marketing company, right? We have all these brands. And so we met with an expert in our consumer insights group to help us understand, like, what's our brand identity? And when you're thinking about a brand identity, you're thinking about what does this brand promise? And in order to understand that, you need to really deeply understand your consumer, in this case, our employees. What is the character of that person? You know, what are they like, and what need are they trying to solve? And we landed on pride as kind of the characteristic of a General Mills employee. Employees here are very proud to work here. They're proud of making it to work at General Mills, and they're proud of being here. And in fact, I was in a focus group with our HR team at one of our manufacturing plants, and it was interesting. Somebody mentioned that pride of walking into the grocery store and seeing a product they made, and they kind of all started talking about, yeah, do you look at the date stamp? Do you look at the, you know, they know the run, you know, there's just this sense of, I was part of that. I have this commitment. So what's the need of a proud person? Well, a proud person might not feel comfortable saying they don't know the answer. They might not want to admit they don't know the answer. So very quickly, we focused our messaging on, you don't need to be the expert on these things. You need to be the expert on knowing when you need to get help. And our training can focus on issue spotting and then talk to this person, you know, and I think we wanted to capture then also the questions that people were raising, because we wanted to make sure we were understanding where there might be gaps. So we included those in our case management system. And when we wrote stories about issues that employees had faced, you know, issues of misconduct, we included really great questions people raised and highlighted those in our stories that we wrote early on. So people got a sense of, well, what kinds of questions might I come to ethics and compliance for? And I think that really drives our results. We see a 70-30 split. So 30% of what I have in my system are questions that have come to me, most of them on conflicts of interest. And that's, I like to think, like you said, Carrie, that just shows people want to know the right answer before they make a mistake. And it gives me hope that we have a lot of people who are willing to come forward. It also drives our low anonymity rate because people are asking first. And so it's a stat that I'm proud of, and I hope that continues to stay as strong as it's been.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, that the data on this slide really often comes down to how we communicate about the program. Mm-hmm. How do we market to, like you said, how do we market the line? Is this just the last resort? Or is it a stop in wherever you're most comfortable? And the organizations, from my perspective, who get the most inquiries and who probably have the lowest anonymous reporting, market as, we're here as a resource. We're here to answer your questions. We're here because nobody in this organization knows everything, but we're all here to help each other. And that's very different branding from, just only call me if there's fraud, bribery or corruption.
Mm-hmm.
So, and we're seeing that, those organizations are also getting more reports, although it's consistent with last year. And it's unfortunate because before the pandemic, we were over 2 reports per 100 employees for organizations that track reports from all sources. But I think with the pandemic and remote work, what we're seeing here is less ability to just walk in and say, hey, Chris, what do you think? And so if you're tracking the walk-ins and you can't walk in anymore, I think that's what we're seeing here. But again, I think you also had something you wanted to comment here.
Yeah, just that, we indicate where we get our cases from. And so we have a generic ethics at Gen Mills line. That's where most of my questions come in, as somebody just emails me. Well, it comes to me or they email me directly. But we also are tracking, questions that come into global security or audit or HR. I mean, behind the scenes, we're sort of telling employees, just get it to one of these cats, behind the scenes, we're a big safety net. We know who's going to be on point for each of these issues. We'll get it to the right group. We'll coordinate the investigation. Your job is to be the expert on getting it raised. And so because we're collecting from all those different places, I think that it just creates this more safety in the speak up process. And so I mentioned, I get to sit in on audits with our leadership around the world. So during the pandemic, it's made it easier. I can just Zoom on those calls and get to hear how they're reflecting and hearing our values and how they're understanding our program. That's a great opportunity too, to just once again get my face out there. Here's another friendly person who's willing to listen. And our global security team is here. I've met some of my global security friends for the first time in person this week. And they were asking, what can we do to continue to promote ethics and compliance? And my answer was like, you're the face of the investigator to so many people. Help them understand what the process looks like. Help them understand the role you play, that you're there to help, that you're there to help resolve and make sure we get to the best next place. And I think when we can have that as our ambassador for the program, then there'll be another point of contact for people to come to, and then we can collect that and then continue to learn, like, where do we need to do more.
Awesome. All right, well, I know there's some questions that have come in. I'm going to
let's see here what we got.
End, but let's just quickly, the impact of the Great Resignation. And if you go to the link on this slide, this is actually an interactive graph. And so it's kind of busy, but I think the point here is this is the number of resignations in 2021. And frankly, this line, I don't know if you see my arrow, but that was the number of resignations in 2020. So everybody hunkered down in 2020. And I think we are in a situation now where people are more emboldened because they can say, I am less afraid of retaliation because I can go down the street and get another job, and probably another job making more money. So I think all of this is kind of coming together to kind of put us in a situation where people are calling it as they see it these days.
Yeah.
So emerging trend 3, and I know we had a couple of questions about this, so want to make sure we get to this and cover that, which is the complaints about retaliation, discrimination, and harassment did spike in 2021. And the implication here, and it's sort of been coming through the flow of the conversation, is that employees are more attuned to workplace civility issues. And frankly, I think they're more tired. They're tired of fighting with people over this, that, or the other thing. And they just have lost patience. And so I think we're seeing that as well coming through our systems. So this first observation was that retaliation complaints have jumped remarkably, I would say, because we've always been around 1% of all the reports, or even under 1%. And so to go almost nearly double from 2020 to 2021 is potentially a canary in the coal mine that we need to be more ready for these concerns. We know that people are less likely to report about retaliation, because why would you stick your neck out again after you raised an issue the first time? So to see these reports go up, I think, is incredibly significant. And then we also saw just a slight uptick, but we're at 24% of the allegations of retaliation being substantiated. That's about half of the overall cases, which is at 43%, I believe I said. So it's still not a high number. I know these are difficult cases to prove, but it's something to note that we've stayed pretty steady here and maybe ticking up a little bit. And then here is where we had some questions, and I'm really, really fascinated by this one. And that is percentage of harassment reports. So if you think about the primary years of Me Too, it started at the end of 2017, was in, really high topic of conversation, both in the public and frankly, in many of our boardrooms about this. And so we did see a jump in 2021 that was even higher than the Me Too movement. So allegations of harassment reports. Somebody asked about substantiation. That's pretty high. 48% of harassment reports have been substantiated. And then the other interesting observation that we note is with 2020 being the year that George Floyd was killed, and Kristen, you're in the Minneapolis area, right? That 2021 saw an even higher percentage of discrimination reports than in the year that George Floyd was killed. So a lot happening in this space. And I know we're pretty close on time, but comments you have on this. I know you had a couple of key comments you want to point out here.
One thing I wanted to just quickly touch on is, in partnership with our employee relations and employment law team, we have a training that we've been leading for several years for new leaders, and new leaders being new managers. And it's part of their training as a manager to learn what we call our engaging leader behaviors. Big one of those is productive discourse, making it safe for people to come to you, provide pushback even on a strategy or a plan or raise concerns. And you probably can guess, like, the theme of that material is know when to escalate, know when to get your resources involved. That deck covers kind of the core places where managers can really get tripped up. Accommodation requests, which can lead to issues around discrimination, discrimination concerns, how they're picking teams and things like that. Harassment, and we couch that under the workplace romance, can I date my coworker? And we talk about all the, you leave it to your compliance group to talk to you about dating in the workplace. The last place you thought you're going to get that advice. But it's really critical to help managers understand the new hat they wear as a manager. And you're a manager wherever you go. And then also whistleblowing retaliation claims. And the number one theme is don't go it alone, right? When these things happen, get HR involved, get ethics and compliance involved. We're here to help. And we created it as a kind of as a study guide, or just a guide that we packaged up so it's more self-study, and pushed it out to all of our director and above employees, all of our HR teams. Again, just really reinforcing, it doesn't matter how high up you go. We need you to know when you need to get an expert involved, because these situations are really tricky. We want to make sure they're handled with a lot of care. So I know we have a couple questions here. Do we want to get to the end here and then
Let's go back to our question? Summary, and then we'll go back to the question.
Okay, awesome.
And then there was actually one thing I forgot to ask you, because you mentioned when we were preparing for this session that you actually, and I know we had actually some questions about questions, like what kind of questions you get. And you actually publish in a newsletter some of the questions that you get and the answers that you give. So maybe just talk about that for a minute.
Yeah, and it's something we were doing early on. I don't publish the stories anymore because we're starting to tell the same story. The questions were kind of the same, but we're using a lot of different channels and training to do that. But we had early on some what we called ethics matters, and we had a little thumbs up, thumbs down for, oops and yay. And the questions were often around, like, can I expense this? Can I take this job? Can my vendor pay for me to travel? Can I, just all the questions that come up that we want people to think through. And then we would explain, like, here's the situation, here's our response, here's why, and here's the policy you can look at to follow up. And now we take those and we plug those kinds of stories and situations into our training. We have a Yammer presence. You know, some people are listening on that channel, not everybody, but there we can be a little more playful. And so we'll do some more playful things around understanding these issues when we're launching a new training. And so we're trying to really gear up those questions and helping people have that antenna for, again, not to be an expert in how to manage them, but, oh, I remember, you know, these situations happen, and we're using the questions we received and documented as the fodder for that training, for those comms, so that we're being relevant to what we're receiving.
Remind me from the Wayback Machine. I used to write a column called Ask Miss Ethics.
Yes.
Because when I got appointed, they started calling me Ms. Ethics.
I know, I'm the ethics lady. Yeah.
And so I started to write a Dear Abby column that, and people would sign it, you know, frustrated in Philadelphia, right? And so we had this whole running column of questions, and I think that it goes a long way to encouraging people to get to know the ethics and compliance people without them being in the investigation mode, but being in the helpful mode.
Right.
So just to sort of wrap up our summary thoughts, and I think we've answered a lot of the questions as we've gone through, but we did want to close with some key takeaways. You know, one is that COVID is still continuing to impact reporting. I think it's still going to do that. And I don't know in terms of, you know, the issues that come along with remote work and some of the ways that we are going to need to communicate with employees about reporting. I mean, Chris and I were both talking about, you know, our offices are open, but nobody's really coming back. So, you know, it is going to require us to think differently and communicate differently about reporting, and to ensure that we build trust, right? Because if you're not in the same room, or, you know, talking to somebody at the water cooler, you know, you forget that maybe that's a resource, or somebody that, yes, this is somebody I might go to if I had a question. So, and with that has come the time where people aren't, what was that movie?
Ready to go on. I think we have one question. You feel our employees use these big words when types of allegations are not really happening? Example, they're being discriminated because their performance appraisal was not good, or they didn't get a raise. Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, and that's part of what we include in that training for managers is, you know, oftentimes these issues come up in the middle of a performance management situation. And so one example we have in that is, you know, for a accommodation request is you're getting ready to put someone on a performance management plan, and they're talking about how their headaches are really disrupting their life. And that's a time to hit pause and say, oh, this might, you know, people aren't going to say, I need an accommodation because I have a headache. I mean, you know, I have migraines, right? They're going to say, gosh, I'm really struggling with this. And our managers need to be attuned to that and say, oh, I need to check with HR to see if I need to first address the accommodation needs, and then we can parallel path any performance. But that accommodation need might be impacting performance, so we need to think about that. And so absolutely, I don't think people are going to use they might use bigger words when it's a smaller thing, but as managers or as ethics and compliance people, we need to understand that what they're experiencing is what they're experiencing, and we have to kind of work through, like, how do we help the frontline people respond appropriately?
Yeah, and I think, you know, I think it's important to take care in ascribing motives to individuals who are raising issues. You know, and again, you know, in my experiences, sometimes I didn't like why they happened to decide to call me, but it didn't mean that they didn't have good information or that there wasn't something bad happening. And so I think it's important, as much as we can, to step away from ascribing motive and just looking at the issues. So
yeah, and I think there are stats that show people who have been harassed, it might take them 18 months to raise that concern. So we really try to sensitize people that when we talk about these issues, they're super personal and they're sensitive. So we have to kind of think about that first, and then we can kind of get into what's the right way to resolve it.
So we have another minute left. What are your final thoughts on all of this?
You know, I think, you know, I think this report that you put out is great. And I think when we have data like this, you know, I use it to sort of explain context for our reports to our board of directors, our audit committee. And so I just really encourage people to spend time with this data source. And if you're not matching it exactly, to kind of get curious about why and what's different and where are you seeing changes. And if you don't have enough surround, you don't have access to engagement results or your own ethical culture survey results, to think about like, well, where can you get some insights into your own personal trends and how they sit in context with this report. Carrie mentioned it's a median, right? There's going to be some lower and some higher. And nobody's right. But just sort of understanding the context of it, I think is a really powerful way to provide more insight into what you're working on and focused on. And I think it's just a useful tool. So use the tools that are available to you.
And maybe a final point from me is, don't just look at them at the high level, right? The organizational level. Really do the drill down, because that's where you'll catch the trends, by business or by location or by geography. Because, everybody's going to have their norm and they're going to be kind of in and out of their norm. And when this happens or when that happens, then you want to go look at what might be driving that. What are the other issues? What are the cultural factors that are happening? So, well, thank you all for joining us in this session today. Chris, so great to work with you on this. It's been so much
Carrie.
fun.
Thank you.
All right. Everybody enjoy the rest of the conference.
Enjoy, everyone. Thank you.